Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar, Least Restrictive, Most Effective. What does it mean to behavioral services / behavior analyst? I'm Heike Johns, Learning and Development Director for the Division of Developmental Disabilities. I'll be your host today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Your line is muted upon entry. However, we always suggest that you mute your line from your side as well. If you have questions regarding technical issues, difficulty, or something with sound, if you'll put those in the chat box, we'd appreciate that. If you have questions or responses to today's content, we ask that you put those in the Q&A box. Also, we have a full studio today, so we will be doing a little bit of mic shuffling, so I apologize in advance if there's a little extra background sound that we may have going on. And with that, I am going to turn it over to today's presenters and allow them to introduce themselves, and so that you can have that name and voice recognition paired together.
Hi, this is Dr. Terry Rogers. I'm the Chief Behavior Analyst, and any spelling errors in this presentation are my fault. Actually, I embedded them to see how attentive you are. And now Rita.
Hi, good morning. It's Rita Cooper, the Western Region Area Behavior Analyst.
Good morning. This is Melantha Witherspoon, the Eastern Region Area Behavior Analyst.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lucas Evans, Central Area Behavior Analyst. We've got the whole team here.
Okay. So if you have if you're a behavior analyst and you want to get BACB approved continuing education credits, there are a few things that you need to do, and they're on the next slide. So the first thing you need to do is send in the Q&A box your name, your BACB number, and your email address. If you're in a room with multiple people who want to each get this continuing education credit, each person needs to enter into the Q&A box their name, their BACB number, and their email address. Also, each person will have to answer the polling questions, and when we ask for comments, provide comments. So it is mandatory participation. If you don't participate each time, then I can't give you CE credits. So please pay attention to that. If you want to have continuing education credits, you need to put in the Q&A box your name, your BACB number, and your email address, and you need to answer all of the polling questions and provide comments. And at the end of the presentation, you need to sign out in the comment box. If I don't get your sign out, I won't give you CEs. So please remember to do that. Okay. The objectives for today are, well, first of all, let me start with this. This presentation is primarily for new members or people interested in becoming members of the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. However, we are going to be providing you with 2 ethics continuing education credits, and the material is not specific to Regional Behavior Support Review Committees. We think it's just good practice, skills, and knowledge. So if you're not thinking of being a regional committee member, that's okay. We think it will help you in your practice also. So today, we're going to describe the history of the concept of least restrictive. We're going to apply that concept as an ethical legal issue and the concept of most effective as a behavioral concept, and describe the relevance to behavioral services. We're going to describe the variables that might affect the restrictive aspect of an intervention. We're going to demonstrate evaluation of those variables to determine the relative restrictive level of an intervention. Members of the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee and practitioners of ABA will review the related legal authority for oversight of behavioral practices, and members of the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee and practitioners of ABA will review the practice guidelines and parameters established in our professional organization and in position statements, federal and state rule, and contracts and waiver definitions. So that's a big task set out for us, and that's just the first half of this presentation, because we have a second half of a presentation. It's a 2-hour event, and the second half is going to be doing some of the review of materials that we might see in a committee. So our first polling question, remember, you're going to each respond in to the polling question. How often do you think about the restrictiveness of strategies when you're creating interventions? A, B, C, or D? How often do you think about it? No wrong answer, just really want to know what's happening out there. All right, so 29 of the 34 participants have responded. I'm going to assume that the 5 participants that did not respond are not looking for continuing education credit. So hopefully that's true. If it's not true and you did try to respond, comment, I guess, or if you had a problem, put it in the chat box. Okay, so most of you are saying that you, each time you develop an intervention, you're thinking about the restrictiveness, which is what we hope to see, and we hope is what our practice standards are out there. One person said when you think you might have to use some aversive contingencies, and one person said whenever someone requires it. Shame on you. So what we want you to do is think about it every time you do an intervention, because in a little while we're going to talk about how just not using an aversive is not necessarily positive. So it might be restrictive. Okay, next question. If you evaluate restrictiveness of the strategies you develop, are you considering short-term and long-term effects of those strategies for the individual? A, B, or C? All right, so this time we only had 3 people not answer. So we're getting better at answering polling questions. That's great. And most of you answered always, so that's, of course, the answer that I'm looking for, because we should always be thinking about the long-term and the short-term effects of our interventions, and whether the long-term effects are restrictive for the individual or the situation, and whether the short-term effects are. So good news. All right, and the next polling question is, do you believe that peer review is a worthwhile process to evaluate restrictiveness of interventions? So yes, no, or maybe. All right, so hopefully I'm going to convince the one person who said maybe that peer review is a worthwhile process when it's done in a structured and fair manner, which is what we try to do in the Regional Behavior Support Review Committee, fair and helpful manner. And most of you said yes, so that's really good news. And we have 4 no answers, so I'm just assuming we have about 4 folks who aren't looking for continuing education credit. So the next concept, the next thing we want to talk about is that concept of least restrictive. So you're probably all familiar that least restrictive is not a behavioral term. We use it because it's been legally imposed on us. And the legal concept of least restrictive started in 1960 in a lawsuit where teachers sued a school district who was wanting the district to have each teacher name list the names of the organizations that they belong to, and were wanting to do this in order to see if people were belonging to organizations that the district didn't want them to, or didn't support, or might be against some of the political nature of that district. So the teachers sued, and they won that lawsuit, and the lawsuit decision said that you couldn't ask for information like that. It wasn't least restrictive, and you had to allow for personal liberty. So that seems really not related to how we talk about least restrictive. In 1972, one of the first legal cases that brought least restrictive into the social service world was Lessard and versus Schmidt, and it was the suit was brought on behalf of a civilly committed individual, and the court suggested that there were alternatives to being civilly committed that would be least restrictive. And so they ruled that no one could be committed unless alternatives had been deemed unsuitable. And Romero and Youngberg in 1980 used the concept of least restrictive as a safeguard against unnecessary infringement of individuals' rights by the state. Of course, we have Public Law 94-142 in education, where you had to consider least restrictive alternatives in educating individuals with disabilities and behavior problems, and Turnbull in 1981, where placement and treatment settings had to be considered least restrictive. So the concept of least restrictive came from lawsuits and was brought into social service agencies and education arenas, and we have, of course, that's where we operate, and so now we have to consider that as people operating within that context. So how is it applied in behavior analysis? Well, the Florida Blue Ribbon Panel, if you took Bailey's ethics course or read the Bailey and Birch ethics book, then you know about that Florida Blue Ribbon Panel, and that was where behavioral procedures, the result of that Blue Ribbon Panel is behavioral procedures were identified as being in one of three levels of restrictiveness, which required different expertise and oversight in order to use in Florida. And since then, we're dealing with public perception and understanding of behavior analysis, or at that point in time, behavior modification, as being skewed towards the use of aversives and punishment. So when, in many places, when you say behavior analysis, they think behavior modification, and they think the application of aversives and punishment. And so we have a public perception that we are already restrictive just to be using behavioral procedures, which is something that we need to keep in mind as practitioners of behavior analysis. Even though it's a science-driven practice, it's not going to be funded if the public rejects us. So that's something that we really need to keep in mind. In 1993, there was an article by Johnston and Sherman, and I really like this article. So prior disclosure, also, Johnston was one of my main instructors. So again, full disclosure. But they talk about this implementation of a hierarchy, like the one that came out of the Florida Blue Ribbon Panel, and like is written in many state and state laws and in the policies of many institutions, is not really a good idea. It's very problematic because restrictiveness is not inherent in a procedure. It's part of the context, and it varies with different aspects of context and of the individual's history, and it needs to be evaluated based on those variables for each particular case. So they do not support the use of a taxonomy of less restrictive strategies because for any person, one strategy, even positive reinforcement, depending on the situation, might be more restrictive than for another person. So they don't apply all the same.
So another thing to mention this, to go back to Dr. Rogers' point about being concerned about perceptions of behavior analysis by the public and not being funded, also to extend that, being aware of least restrictive as a concept and successfully applying it and be culturally sensitive to the use of restrictive interventions also guards against or kind of helps the field kind of manage itself. Otherwise, as a product of that a potential poor view of the field brings into creates the potential that additional state laws and rules will be developed by non-behavioral folks that use this sort of taxonomical approach that we wouldn't necessarily agree with based on what literature says. So it's extremely important to consider, not just for your individual person, but also for the field at large.
And in addition, science without ethics is problematic, and not really. Science has gone in places that we don't really like without that application of ethics, or at least some people don't like and some people love. So we need to consider that. Johnston and Sherman again said cultural values were very important in considering restrictiveness, but that even among professionals, it was going to result in protracted debates and emotional overtones. So it's going to be hard to apply those cultural values and considerations in evaluating restrictiveness. And but they also said that even though it's hard, it's still going to be important for us to do that so that we can have consistent application and avoid deleterious effects on our clients. So we need to undertake this difficult discussion and consideration, and not just rely on a simplistic hierarchy. Okay, Heike, next slide. All right, so they made some suggestions as to what basic considerations for a model to evaluate strategies, because you need to have some guided discussion. And so they said, because the problem with having a specific tool or a hierarchy is that you might overlook some idiosyncratic factors. So you need to consider generality of your evaluation and the factors that you utilize. You need to consider that each situation is individualized and look at all of those variables within that individualized consideration. Take a functional approach to consequences and not just do it based on physical characteristics. So here's an example. Early in my career, I was working in a school as a one-on-one instructor, and I had a young child, a 9-year-old, who engaged in severe head banging, mostly against concrete surfaces. And he would bang his head so hard that if you were in the next room, you could feel it through the concrete floor. You could feel it through the walls, and it would make you nauseous. It was very, very hard. And in doing the assessment of his behavior, well, actually, just in supporting him, I discovered that he really liked to spray water in his face. So when you tried to get him to wash his hands, he would flip the water in his face from the fountain. He'd lean over and flip the water in his face from the faucet. And so I thought, I wonder if I can do a DRO using water mist to spray. And so I tried spraying it low, because, you're not allowed to spray water mist in a kid's face. And he would just lean down and get it onto his face. So turned out the DRO reinforcer for him was spraying water in his face. I presented this at the first FABA conference and raised some eyebrows because people were thinking water mist in the face had to be a punisher. So it was quite interesting to have the discussion around my poster that this was a reinforcer, and it was how I got longer and longer periods of no head banging, not because he was avoiding it, but because he was earning it. So just an example of functional, not physical characteristics. And we need to separate procedures from consequences, distinguish between the procedure itself. So people might say, well, you can't use negative reinforcement procedures because that's aversive. Well, then we need to think about using food as a reinforcer, because we're actually using a negative reinforcement principle there in avoiding satiation and hoping that we're judiciously providing food that's going to be reinforcing because they're in a state of deprivation, and then that would actually be a negative reinforcement process if you think about it. So you can't just do it based on the procedure. You can't just do it based on the topography. You have to think about them as how they're functioning. And we need to, Johnson and Sherman said it would be inappropriate to take into account the dangers of the procedure and the ease of use and misuse. And in that point, I disagree. And of course, this is an ethical discussion and not a black and white discussion. So unless you work for me, you don't have to really follow my my opinions, but if you work for me, you do. So sorry, guys. Things for us to think about. The Johnson and Penny and Sherman article have things for us to think about. So another article that I found quite interesting was one I recently found that came out of Norway, and it was done by Isketh, Lovas, and Holden in 2006, and this was one of Lovas's last articles that he wrote, and they looked at the use of aversive and restrictive interventions in behavioral treatment in Norway, and they discussed the educational, the therapeutic, and the scientific context within which aversives and restrictive procedures should be used and evaluated if they're employed. They described causes of behavior, so they went through an ABA discussion, and they talked about alternatives to aversives and restrictives, and the current Norwegian legislation that was in place on restrictives, and then they proposed some guidelines for practice, which I think are very interesting, and so we're going to talk about those for a few minutes. Okay, Heike? All right, so Norwegian Law 4A. They don't have very many laws, evidently, so they don't have single numbers. We don't have single number laws, but was enacted in 2004, and it was applicable to the delivery of care in residential homes and institutions, so not family homes and not schools. And it described restrictive procedures as needing to be also ethically acceptable. And what comes to mind immediately here is the Judge Rottenberg Center, and although ethical is not black and white, and so there are some, of course, proponents of the Judge Rottenberg Center's electric shock device with the white noise and all the other aversive characteristics, but the majority of opinion appears to be, especially with the public, that it's not ethically acceptable. So that's what comes to mind there. It has to be generally accepted by the professional community, so having a small minority of professionals saying it was okay would not be according to this Norwegian law. Other solutions must have been attempted before these restrictive procedures can be implemented. Caretakers and guardians have to participate in the decision-making process. They have to be informed about legal rights to appeal, and there has to have been a government entity that assisted in the development, execution, and evaluation of the procedures, and in the attempts to find other solutions, and that government entity could overrule the decision at any time. So this is what the Norwegian law said, and their guidelines are right along the consistent with that Norwegian law, in that they say guidelines for practice are that non-restrictive interventions have to have been attempted and documented as ineffective, including a quantitative description of behavioral reliability of data assessed. So you have to assess the reliability of your data, and also assess desirable behaviors, and you have to provide an evaluation of treatment fidelity. Those are really high standards in the United States, because in the states that we're aware of, that reliability of data, also assessing desirable behaviors, and also providing an evaluation of treatment fidelity is not something we see. We never see all three of those together, and we rarely see any one of those. So that's just us and what we see, and we may not be seeing everything that's out there, but these are very high standards, which I approve of. You have to inform the parents and the relatives and the community of the intent to use those procedures. That's what they suggest. They have to be scientifically validated, so you can't have made it up in your garage. You have to teach alternative behaviors, and you have to teach them using effective teaching methods. You have to have medical assistants on call, and you have to emphasize the importance of providing staff training in how to apply non-aversive interventions, as in teaching appropriate communication and other social skills. You have to be supervised by qualified colleagues in a peer review situation. You need to take objective data to evaluate the positive and negative effects of aversive interventions. And again, I think if you look even at our applied literature, you don't see the positive and negative effects of aversive interventions described. And you have to do long-term follow-up, and that's another thing you don't see in our applied literature, the long-term effects of and benefits of aversive interventions. So those guidelines are really high bars as far as I can see, but I like that direction. I like those bars.
You
Go
can
ahead.
also see that many elements of the guidelines for Norway also parallel some of the requirements of our checklist for the Behavior Support Review Committee and the assessment of behavior support plans. So, keep in mind, Norway has this bar really high, and when you're having your plans reviewed or you're looking at review of plans, that, even though there are a lot of items on the checklist, that these are really critical elements to the effectiveness of plans.
Okay, so now we're going to try to apply those guidelines to some examples. These are very brief examples, so you can fill in whatever you need to in order to be able to provide an answer. You're going to write in to the Q&A box, so these are not going to be ABCD questions. You're going to write into the Q&A box. And here's your example. We have a young man in his 20s. I'm going to give you extra information. He has an IDD. He has some kind of intellectual disability, and he's sleeping in a crib. No other supports have been tried. He's sleeping in the crib. That's what you know right now. So what I want you to write in are some issues that might affect whether or not that's a restrictive intervention. So is continuing to use what would you consider if you were looking at, is this a restrictive intervention? The other thing that I want you to put into the Q&A box is, do you think continuing the crib as an intervention is appropriate? So this is brought to you. This is what you know. Do you think continuing to use the crib is an appropriate intervention? And if not, what else might you suggest in order to keep him safe and that would be more appropriate? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and I want you to write it into the Q&A box. If you're in a room full of people, remember everyone has to write in an answer in order for it to be, in order for CEs to be provided. But I want you to think about what might affect the restrictiveness of a crib as an intervention. Is it appropriate to continue to use it, and what else do you need to think about? Okay, so I was purposefully vague in that example because I wanted to get some of the kinds of responses that that you all are providing, in which are asking about what's the specifics of the situation. So, for example, as we're talking about it, if this young man is physically capable and the crib is being used because he wanders at night, and you're getting Medicaid waiver services, you're going to have a problem with the home and community-based services rule. I mean, you would have had a problem before, but now with the rule, we have CMS who has stated that they're going to be coming behind and looking at state agencies' oversight of those kinds of things and the use of those kinds of procedures that they have deemed restrictive. So this isn't a behavioral determination, but a legal determination, a funder's determination that would be restrictive, and you have to have other procedures in place. You have to have demonstrated that you have to use this because other things haven't been effective. You have to have teaching appropriate behaviors in place, and you have to be monitoring the effectiveness of that teaching, and you have to be monitoring the need for the continued need. You have to review it regularly, and so it has to go through that would be part of a due process, and then it has to be reviewed by the committee that determines due process did occur. So there's a lot of requirements in place if the young man is physically capable and it's being used for to restrict his movement for wandering. On the other hand, Lucas had a situation in the past year, maybe 2 years. I don't remember. 2 years.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that situation?
Yeah, so there was a young man who was significantly medically involved, and so he had a lot of ongoing medical problems, and was actually literally tethered to a whole bunch of medical equipment. And so he was also fairly profoundly kind of physically and intellectually disabled. And for him specifically, being able to have some sort of area around him that kind of constrained his movement was absolutely necessary to keep him from disentangling the medical equipment. And for him specifically, having some sort of kind of physical containment allowed him the ability to not have to always have a staff person standing next to him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so for him specifically, that may seem like a theme, so we're talking about specific context. So for him, it actually enhanced his ability to have a little privacy while not having to have somebody look over his shoulder. And it wasn't used with the specific intent of kind of keeping him in one spot for staff's convenience. It was more, its purpose was to promote his ability to have some alone time, essentially.
And on the other end of that spectrum, for a person who doesn't have mobility or medical issues, to place them in a crib to restrict their movement because there's a possibility they'll wake up in the middle of the night and elope, you have to take into consideration things that have happened recently in the media where folks have been in cribs and fires have occurred and there's been loss of life. So you have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, it's not safe. So what are you going to do while you're teaching them other ways to not to be safe when they get out of bed and to stay in a safe area? Because I don't know about you, but last night I was up at 3:30 and I didn't actually go back to sleep. So I was walking around my house, not in my bed at 3:30 last night. And I have the ability to do that at any point in the night. I also am relatively safe and relatively appropriate in the community. So those are things that you need to consider. How are you going to teach a person that in their own home? How are they going to be allowed to walk around? How do they maintain safety? How do they learn how to do it so that you don't have to keep them in bed or those kinds of things? And so we need to be working towards, because our context, developmental disabilities, and the funders and the culture of developmental disabilities services says you need to treat them and help them to live a normal life. And that's not a new concept. It's just a very recently reinforced concept. That's our context of work. That's our culture that we work within. We have to meet those standards. You guys had a lot of good thinking. Did you have anything to add, Rita?
Yeah, I think we need to remember that the whole idea behind this is that we want the providers or the individuals that are being funded to continue to get the funding that they need. And if we allow things that are not in compliance with home and community-based waiver, we are looking at small providers or parents or other people having to give back money because they didn't follow what was needed. So, even though people may be uncomfortable with us taking a close look at these interventions, the goal is to actually help people to be in compliance with the home and community-based services waivers.
As well as ethical standards. And we want to have behavior analysis with heart. As Michael Hemingway used to say, if you're familiar with Michael Hemingway and the Michael Hemingway Award, one of his sayings was, we want to have behavior analysis with heart. We don't just want to have a basic science that builds H-bombs and plague viruses out there. So we want to have behavior analysis with heart that's socially acceptable and as well as being effective. And so I think you all answered with sharing for all, which is great. That's something that I should have said to do. And you can see that almost all of you have some really good thinking that's individualized to the situations and asking more questions about the situation. So we might say this is a situation for us to look at more closely, and here are the things that we want to know about and we want to make sure are true. But we didn't, any of us, say, nope, 20-year-old in crib can't happen, restrictive. And that's exactly the kind of discussion that we want to have. So thank you for that. And here's another example. So example 2, there is a program, so serving multiple people, in which all of the individuals have a timeout room as part of their plan. And also as part of their plan, they have a 15-second compliance time. So whenever they're given an instruction or a direction, they have 15 seconds to comply, or timeout is one of the contingencies that happens. So there's a program, timeouts in everyone's plan, there's a 15-second compliance period. What do you think about that? So Heike, what are the questions that we want people to think about? What issues need to be considered to determine if timeout is appropriate and how restrictive it is? And if it's not restrictive, what else might be done to keep people safe and be more appropriate? So assuming that there's some safety measures in that compliance requirement, what else might need to be done? I'm going to give you 5 minutes, so tell us what you're thinking, and please reply to all so everybody can see the discussion. All right. So again, some really good conversation. I wish that I really like doing this training in a group where we're all present and we can have these discussions out loud to each other. But this was almost as effective because you all are doing some really good thinking and asking the questions that we all asked when we reviewed this program. It's an actual program that was existing in the state. And we, none of the people had, well, actually that's not true. A couple of the people had individualized approval for use of timeout for specific behaviors, but then the program administrators decided everybody was going to have it in all of their programs, and compliance was one of the inappropriate behaviors that they, or non-compliance was one of the inappropriate behaviors they chose to also implement timeout for, which if you're familiar with the Division of Developmental Disabilities, you know that's a big no-no because you can't have a generalized program procedure that's restrictive, and you can't have timeout generalized for everybody in that program, and timeout has to be individually approved and come up through my office, and I have a checklist of things that have to be true, which were not true in this program's case. But you guys are asking all of the right kinds of questions that we want you to think about when you come up to something like this, and also when you're reviewing plans as you see them. If you're part of a review committee, we want you to see those and ask those kinds of questions. It might have been appropriate for each individual, but in this situation, I agree with Karen Fry's comment of how do we teach people to say no if we're mandating that kind of compliance, and we're not. This isn't boot camp, and we're not the Army, and we're not sending people out to war, so they don't really actually have to comply to every command. We shouldn't be commanding people. So there's all those kinds of things that we need to think about with that example. So thank you for your participation and consideration, and we're going to move on now. So some of you may be familiar with this article. If you're not, it's a really nice article that frames some of the other side of not just not being aversive, but how to be more positive, and some of the questions that we might ask about that. So Weiss and Noster, they're big in positive behavior supports, which is not evil. So if you're thinking, ooh, bad, not evil. But one of the things that they say is just not putting in aversives. So being non-aversive doesn't necessarily mean you're also being positive. So this calls to mind some of those quote unquote, and not called by Terry, positive behavior support plans that I've seen where there are absolutely no reinforcement procedures described. And so I'm not sure what's positive. It's neither adding something nor positive in the way of common vernacular of being reinforcing. So I'm not sure what was positive about those plans, except for the name. But that's kind of what Weiss and Noster bring up. So they want us to ask these kinds of questions. Does the person have opportunities to express opinions and control in his or her life through meaningful choices? And does this plan promote that? What needs does the person address through his problem behavior, or what function is the behavior? How will our actions influence the person's quality of life? I think that is something that is very, very necessary to consider in our behavior plans, and very often forgotten or not considered. How have the people who know and care about the person participated in the process of developing the plan? How will the approach that is being used affect the people implementing the procedures and others? So that's an interesting thing for us to consider. How will implementing this plan affect the people who have to do it? If the tables were turned, would you use these interventions with selected family members, assuming these are family members you like, or friends, again, assuming the friends are people you like? if the tables were turned, and will these interventions minimize the likelihood of crisis? So if we were considering the program that was using timeout, what we saw in the data is that the use of timeout actually maximized crisis. So we had people in crisis all the time in that program, and that was one of the data points that we used to say, this isn't getting better, this is making the behavior worse. So Weiss and Noster proposed those kinds of questions. Do you guys have anything to add?
If you all are interested, there's another article. It was in a recent issue of Behavior and Social Issues, and I forget the authors. We can send it out with the follow-up. But it describes Israel Golddiamond's concept of freedom. And if you don't know who Israel Golddiamond is, then
look it up.
Go out right now and look it up. Constructionalism. He's done it. He's probably, if you had to nominate an unsung hero of behavior analysis, he'd definitely be right up there. But anyway, so this article talks about his behavioral conception of freedom, which kind of extends Skinner's conception of freedom. And it doesn't use the same words, but it's extremely consistent with what Weiss and Noster are talking about. So he considers degrees of freedom, which is kind of like the number of choices you have throughout your day, and also meaningful choice, which is are these choices tied to critical consequences? So for example, I can choose to do this, but if I choose not to do it, then I don't get to eat. Well, that would not really be a meaningful choice. So it's just another kind of a look at it, and it's also by one of my heroes, Dr. Golddiamond. So check it out. We'll link it, and it's free, so you don't have to actually pay for it because it's in an awesome journal. So I think I would suggest that if people are interested in more about this.
So I really like this article. I make everybody who I work with in the state read this article, and everybody who works for me has to read this article. I think everybody should read it every year and consider how they're living up to those standards of being positive, not just being non-aversive. So a couple of things I want you to consider is APA Division 33, which is the Behavior Analysis Division, has a resolution about restrictiveness, and they say the following things. So you need to be responsive to the needs of the persons and the settings served. You have to give the needs of the person, though, precedence over the organizational needs. So sometimes people will acknowledge that they're doing this because they don't have enough staff, and that use of restrictives without the person's needs being met by it. In other words, it wouldn't be a choice that I would make, and you're using it for me because you don't have enough staff is not a valid reason. You have to be protective of the legal and civil rights, as well as considering the prevailing statutes and standards, and you have to be employed for the purpose of increasing the person's self-control. The person's self-control, not increasing the control of the person, for the purposes of assisting them to achieve enhanced participation in life and their fullest human potential, which I think is important for us to consider. And, next slide, they have a whole lot of other things that they say, like highly restrictive procedures shall not be instituted without reinforcement of other behavior, without determination that less restrictive procedures weren't appropriate or were ineffective. Only if there's immediate physical danger or impairment, and only if there's evidence that the person may be prevented from receiving necessary medical or surgical or emergency medical services. So that kind of touches on in order to keep them safe, you would have to argue that they are about to fall out of bed now, at this instant, and that's why I'm restraining them. Mm-hmm. Not that they might fall out of bed at some time or that they did fall out of bed at some point in the past, but that it was an immediate, right now, physical danger. So that's an interesting resolution by the APA, and evidence that the frequency or intensity of the problem behavior prevents adequate participation in normal activities. that would be appropriate for the individual circumstances and goals. So those are pretty high standards also that are proposed by the APA or promoted by the APA. And they had more, but just some things for us to be aware of. What are the standards within our social service contacts, and especially in Missouri, as the licensure is controlled by our psychologist friends. We have an advisory board that answers to the psychologist board, and so the psychologist board's standards are really the standards that have to be also considered, because they are using those standards to evaluate decisions. So just something to be aware of. Okay, next slide. So here's a polling question. Do the APA guidelines allow, and by allow I mean give permission, or recommend caution? So are they allowing, or are they recommending caution regarding the use of punishment or aversive procedures? So answer A, B, or C. How do you interpret those guidelines? All right, so everybody who answered recommend caution. So I really appreciate that, because I've had discussions with folks in the past that say, well, the BACB standards say that you can use punishment procedures, so that gives me permission to use them. That's not exactly how I read those standards. It doesn't say, yay, go forth and punish, raw. So we want to consider that even though we can use them, doesn't mean we should use them. So maybe that's another article. I should write to Weiss and Noster and say, even though we can use them, doesn't mean we should use them. Yep. Title for a new article. All right, so Heike has been reading your comments, and we realized that you all are not able to see each other's comments during our discussion, which I am really sad about, because you had some really great comments. And that's probably a result of some setting that she has, which we're not going to adjust now for fear of screwing everything else up. But we'll be aware of it in the future. And what we'll do to compensate for that is we will categorize your comments. And when we send out and post this, we will include the kinds of comments that you all made, so you can have some benefit from the discussion. We'll also send out the article that Lucas mentioned, and at the end of this presentation are all of the references minus Lucas's article. So you'll have the articles that are there, and if you're unable to access those articles because you're not affiliated with a university or don't have the articles aren't available to you via Googling, which is where I get most of mine, then if you let me know, I will send those articles out to you because I have them electronically. So we'll try to get all of that information out to you, or we can send it through your Regional Behavior Support Review Committee. Mm-hmm. We'll try to get that information out to you because they were good, really good comments, and we learn by discussion with our peers. Our verbal community is very important And so I want to promote that. But here's another polling question. Nope, not another polling question. Heike moved on. I was confused. Sorry. Yeah. All right. So another thing that we have to consider when we're evaluating what procedures to use and writing plans, and when we're evaluating plans, is the dimensions from Beowulf and Risley. So just a reminder of what those dimensions are, or how we're interpreting them. Applied addresses socially significant behavior for the person. Analytic is applying those principles of ABA in a way that evaluates the effect on improving behavior. Behavioral targets behavior in a precise way with measurement. Conceptually systematic means the techniques are relevant to the principles of ABA, so not hypnosis. Technological means that the techniques making up a particular application are completely identified and described, and usually that's also described as such that an educated lay person could read the description and do a fairly good job of implementing the plan. So that's not the way that we want plans to be trained, but that's the standard that we want to reach when we're describing things. And generality, that the behavior change is durable over time, appears in a wide variety of possible environments, and spreads to a wide variety of related behaviors. And so the best of all generality meets all three of those characteristics, but we should be achieving whatever's relevant for that behavior change should have generality. And large enough of an effect for practical value. So I like to say that we don't care if it's significant at a 0.01 level. It has to be visible to the naked eye. So those are the dimensions of ABA, and we need to apply those to least restrictive. So next slide. Oops. Oh, Chad says, get a cab. God, Chad, I didn't know you were so rude. Yeah, that's a great way to remember it. All right, so polling question. How would a quick effect aversive, like electric shock device, meet the obligation of generality? All right, so you're using a quick effect aversive like electric shock. How do you meet that obligation of generality? So this is just your opinion, and you may be smarter than me, and so you may be able to figure out how to make it meet the obligation. But A, it could not, as the presence of the mechanism would necessarily limit the transfer of stimulus control to other environments. Boy, that answer sounds smart. B, the procedure would need to be run 24/7 wherever the person went. Or C, that is an issue to be considered when the behavior reduces to zero. So what's your answer? If I ask you that question, you're using electric shock, what's your answer? Okay, so this was really a fun question to think about how you're answering it. And here's our preference. Our preference is that you consider generality from the get-go, so that your procedures are starting to think about how am I going to withdraw behavioral services and anything that's atypical for the environment, and get the person's behavior under the control of naturally occurring stimuli as much as possible from the get-go, because that will in part guide how strange your procedures are and how intrusive the intervention is, and how much people implementing it have to play twister in order to be able to do it, which makes it less difficult to implement and all that kind of stuff. So our preference is that you're thinking about generality from the get-go, and we really hate those plans that say generalization. We'll be considering generalization as soon as the behavior reduces to 0 for 12 months. We hate those plans because pretty much we think that means you're not considering generalization at all. And probably you never will. So, and that's one of the big criticisms culturally of behavior analysis, is that it's so intrusive and I don't know if specialized what I want to say, but weird, that it only works when there's the plan's in place, which, yeah, duh, but really it's a criticism of we haven't been considering natural stimuli and stimulus control. So.
And if you think about when people talk about, that ABA stuff, it's just sticker charts and candy canes, and really, and what you really need to be talking about is intrinsic motivation and not extrinsic motivation. And really, what they're referring to, I think, is talking about typical contingencies rather than contrived contingencies. And anytime you are contriving a circumstance to create a change in behavior, you have to uncontrive that situation and still maintain the effect that you want on the behavior. And so you've got to be thinking about that from the beginning when you're designing your program. Otherwise, you may start down a path that doesn't lead to generalization, and also get somebody stuck in an extremely weird, contrived circumstance, like having to walk around with a battery-filled backpack that runs a shock device that controls your self-injury.
Guess what presentation Lucas recently went to? All right, so yes, Heike is pointing me to a question. You did not pose the question to what would lead to generalization, but rather could generalization be possible? Yeah, I know. Yeah, so could it be possible? I believe that it could be possible, and I believe that you need to think about it from the beginning. And maybe one of the things you do is run it 24/7 wherever the person goes, but you also need to be considering about the natural contingencies and what alternatives and reinforcement and all those things. And really, I don't know right now of a situation where electric shock would be my go-to intervention. But maybe there would be a situation where I might eventually get there. It wouldn't be within the context of services in DD, though, for the most part. So, because I don't have an environment that I control enough to be able to do that. So Alyssa, I copied right from Beowulf and Risley, generality, and most people consider that to be generalization. And I know that Johnston talks about generalizations, not generality, and all that stuff, but most folks talk about it like it's the same thing, and so we're not being that careful with our terminology here. Next slide. So here's some questions that we think need to be discussed when we're considering the restrictiveness of a plan, and given this current format, we're not going to be able to have a good discussion of it, but we think you need to be considering the current quality of the person's life and the effect of on the quality of life for the person if that plan or the strategies are being implemented. So quality of life of the person, and I have that as the first consideration because I think that colors everything else, and especially within developmental disability services, if you take the degrees of freedom argument of Gold Diamond, we see that they have very few degrees of freedom in most situations in which we provide services. So something for us to consider. Most of the time, in the times that I've been consulting with for individuals, the intervention could best be described as improving the person's quality of life and not really so stringently applying complex principles and strategies of behavior analysis. So most of the time, I'm improving the person's quality of life, and I see a significant change such that behavioral strategies are less necessary. So are the basic needs of the person met? Is there an enriched lifestyle? Can you put that in place? That's all quality of life. Part of quality of life is the frequency and amount of reinforcement regularly available for desirable behaviors. So when I go in to do a functional assessment, I look at what the consequences are for the undesirable behaviors, but I also look at what the consequences are should a desirable behavior occur. So what are the occurring consequences for desirable behaviors and how frequent are those? The likelihood that a procedure will be used, designed, and discontinued as specified. The likelihood and design to generalize effects of the strategies if they work, the effect of the procedures on the implementers and the reputation of the person, and the side effects of the procedures. So I think those are important considerations, especially the reputation of the person, because the more complicated the plan, the more restrictive the environment they come from. What I see in our services is that they have less chances to transition out of those situations because providers look at them as somehow tainted or needing that level of restrictiveness and that not being something that they can support. And I think, Rita, you've had experience with that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, the more we control as a system, the less self-control, which was one of the requirements previously that the individual has. You know, as Terry was talking, I was considering a situation that occurred the other week where it didn't happen with a behavior provider, but just in the general environment, they wanted to help the person do their ADLs and personal hygiene, and they were considering that they would monitor this individual by a sniff test. You know, really? You know, what's that going to do for the person's quality of life? You know,
come here, let me smell your armpits.
Let me smell your armpits. And how does that then generalize? I mean, how does and the person knows how to do those skills. It was, you know, staff trying to control the individual, vice the individual having control over their own life, and they really were, because if the individual isn't showering, you know who they're trying to get back at for the whole situation. So it's often kind of funny, the more that the system controls, the less that the person controls, and there's this counter control issue.
I just have a picture of staff walking up and sniffing, and then I have the Far Side cartoon of the dogs sniffing each other in the butt in my head. I'm sorry, that's just the way that I think. Okay, so you need to think about the effectiveness of the strategies and are they likely to be implemented and effective? Are there comorbid conditions? And I don't just mean that medically, but comorbid conditions that might contribute to the problem situation. And so you could think about family dynamics or the environment being very barren, which would, again, go to quality of life, but anything like that might be contributing to the problem situation. The culture of the family, because we need to be much more culturally aware. And so in some cultures, and I'll use what I know about the Native American culture, which is me looking at it as an outsider, and the readings that I've done is often in the Native American culture. And again, this is from my perspective, and it could absolutely be wrong or offensive to individuals from the Native American culture. And I apologize for that. But often what it seems like is in the traditional Native American culture, so not tainted by Western culture and drugs and alcohol and all that kind of stuff. But in the traditional culture, children are very highly valued, and they're also promoted to experiment and really kind of run free and learn from their own actions. And so there are very few controls placed on them and very few episodes of scolding and those kinds of things, and really just encouraged to be free and live life, and that is not traditional Western culture. And so if you went into place and said you need to have a structured schedule, you need to have structured consequences, you need to be teaching right from wrong in a very Western culture kind of way, that would be offensive in the Native American culture. And so we would have to consider, if we were working within that culture, how to work within that cultural context and help them with any kind of behavioral problems. Just an example, again, from my understanding. So we have a question here. How do you get staff to understand that? And I think that we should be having a lot of discussions with staff about those kinds of things, because staff bring in their own family culture and their own understanding of how things should be. And if we don't talk about them openly and kind of raise their awareness to how things are within the system and what kinds of standards we're putting in place, they just do it when we're not around, right? So
I think the key is, because there's not really a simple answer, but I think the key is this conversation and the awareness that there are these other perspectives that need to be considered, and that we just put that out in the open. I think the definite wrong thing to do, if there's a definitive non-example, it's to write a plan and just give it to staff, or promote it to staff, or train it to staff, and just expect them to do it because it's the right thing to do. That would not be consistent with our fundamental principles of how people behave and how behavior change occurs, to just expect that staff should do it because it's the right thing to do. So that wouldn't make sense for an individual that we are supporting. It shouldn't make sense for staff trying to implement a plan. We should be thinking about what contingencies are in place for them to follow or not follow the plan, and making adjustments to ensure that we're being least restrictive for all people involved. So primarily for the specific person receiving the service, but also that we're considering what's least restrictive and most likely to be successful with people that are going to be doing the plan most of the time.
Yeah. And I also think when we create that culture that allows the individual that quality of life, that all basic needs are met, that we're also allowing the staff and the system within which those people operate to emulate those definite qualities. So it's important. It really is important in the factors that we develop, and that we develop plans that meet these areas.
And one of our challenges is that often we're the consultant coming into a situation and not the owner, operator, manager of the staff, so or the situation in which the staff work. And so as a consultant, you really have to go top down as well as talking to the staff and make sure that everybody understands what's necessary, what's effective, what's restrictive, all of those kinds of things. And so we have to think how to be effective as a consultant, and that's not just going to the staff directly and training them. All right, so the red questions are the big topics that we need to consider or the big questions we need to ask ourselves and others when we're looking at developing interventions, or when we're reviewing interventions and giving peer consultation on them, which is how we look at the peer review committee, as a peer consultation committee. I know that Lucas is going to be shocked that I'm going long today, and I was only supposed to do an hour on my part. I know, but we're just going to move on, and part 2 may be Lucas's part and not my part. So another polling question: rate the restrictiveness of each of the following. A differential reinforcement procedure to shape behavior when the not earned situation results in extreme emotional responding. All right, so I was in the grocery line when I thought of this, and in the grocery line, there's candy as you're waiting. And often there are tired mothers or fathers with small children who have grabbed everything all throughout the store and asked for everything all throughout the store. And now they're waiting in front of this candy, which is right there at eye height of 3-year-old. And when you say no, guess what happens? So I thought of this extreme emotional responding and also I've had this experience when I'm doing discrete trials where somebody didn't earn the reinforcer, which of course I've put tantalizingly in front of them, and because they had a wrong answer or they didn't participate in the trial, and then I've had a big meltdown tantrum. And so I'm thinking about these big meltdown tantrums that happen when the differential reinforcement when the reinforcement isn't earned in the differential reinforcement procedure. So how restrictive is this for the person implementing the procedure? For the person implementing the procedure. Highly restrictive, moderately restrictive, or not restrictive at all. And I know there's all kinds of considerations, how old, who's the person, are they doing it for their kid, blah, 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 blah. I don't care about all that. I know it's true. Just your gut, how restrictive is it?
And I think you consider, if you were the one implementing it, how would you feel?
All right, so ABC, answer. All right. So I'm just wondering what you think. There's no right or wrong answer, obviously. How could there be a right or wrong answer to this question? I mean, if you like to make people cry, I would say it's not restrictive at all. And if having people cry is not a happy day for you, then it would be pretty restrictive. But that is something that we need to think about and maybe even poll who are who are having implement plans, because we think a DRO is not a restrictive procedure. But if you think about what the withholding of reinforcement is going to result in, I'm going to tell you that you're going to get a lot of payoffs for bad behavior because people don't want to have that happen in front of them, and they don't want to deal with it. Okay, so the next question. How restrictive is it for the child who experiences that DRO and not earning contingency? Is the procedure highly restrictive, moderately restrictive, or not restrictive at all?
And again, I don't think you need to go for the specifics, but just the general feeling of what that contingency is and earning versus not earning. I know some people may say, oh, so what are they earning? It doesn't really matter.
Okay, so again, if you're considering that you're the child not earning, is it highly restrictive, moderately restrictive, or not restrictive at all? And it probably depends on what you're not earning and how often you get to earn it otherwise and all of those kinds of things. But if it does depend on those things, it's at least moderately restrictive.
Yeah, and I think the key thing to remember here is when we're considering whether something's restrictive or not is not that we're saying that you shouldn't do it or it's not an important goal to work on or it's not the right procedure to use. It's considering that, for example, implementers are going to be uncomfortable doing it, or it's going to be hard for them, or they're not likely to actually go through with it, which would indicate it's more restrictive, or that it's unpleasant for the person experiencing it, which would indicate that it's restrictive. Again, that's not to say that it's not the right thing to do or it's not justified or necessary for this situation, but that we should be considering it. It should be part of our assessment and analysis. And the other thing, if you're interested about looking at how DRO specifically can function across the continuum of their use, there's a really good article from a 2016 issue of JABA with Jessel and, I'm going to say this name wrong, Ingvarsson, I think that's how you pronounce it, where they actually do a good literature survey of research that's been conducted on differential reinforcement of other, and show that depending on how it's deployed, it has several different effects. So it could be punishment, it could be extinction, it could be manipulating motivation. So you really need to consider those sort of things, and they have some suggestions for things you might consider when you're running a DRO specifically, like looking at desirable behaviors that you would want to decrease. So typically when you run a DRO, you think it's fairly innocuous, and you're just concerned about seeing the problem behavior decrease because you're providing a presumed reinforcer on a time schedule as long as the behavior of challenging behavior doesn't occur. But is that actually resulting in reinforcement of other more desirable behavior? How is that actually functioning? And on that challenging behavior, is it punishment? Are you affecting the motivation to engage in the behavior, et cetera, et cetera? So that's a really good article. It's not on Terry's reference list. We will include it. I will send it to you. It's a good article.
Okay, so and again, it's important to say just because something is considered restrictive in a situation doesn't mean that it's prohibited. So a lot of times people equate restrictive with prohibited. I'm not equating it. I'm just saying it's something to be considered. And if you put in place a restrictive procedure, it needs to be surrounded by adequate teaching of alternatives so the person doesn't have to experience that restrictiveness. It needs to be surrounded by extra fidelity measures because you may have people in the environment who are supposed to implement it who won't want to, and so that will affect your fidelity, and then you'll just be exposing a person to aversive contingencies ineffectively, which is just mean. And you'll need to put in extra quality of life measures. So you don't want to just make a person's life suck because they have bad behavior or dangerous behavior. You want to be about making people's lives better. And so if you have to use a procedure like that, you need to be doing extra stuff to make people's lives better in order to have moral, I think, application of procedures. So it doesn't really matter what the behavior is. It might be in that person's situation, all other things have been ineffective, and that it's likely to be implemented, and it's likely to be effective, and there's ways that you can make their life more positive, and you might still use that restrictive intervention. But those other things need to be considered. Okay, so here's another situation. So we just had a minor DRO with a minor tantrum. That's a different, that might be so like, duh, for you all that you would say, what's the big deal? Why is she making a big deal about it? But here's another extreme. You have a large gentleman who's frequently punching people in the face, and the proposed intervention is a brief manual hold. So one, you're holding the person to keep them from hitting again, but the hold is also functioning as a, if you will, timeout from ability to engage in other behaviors, so receive other reinforcement, hopefully. So how aversive or restrictive is this to the implementer? And I'll just tell you that the last person the guy hit, he broke their face. So how aversive is it to the implementer to do a brief manual hold? Okay, so most of you said moderately restrictive. One person said not restrictive at all. I'd like you guys to come work with somebody that I have in mind, and you'll be the ones doing the brief manual hold, because from my perspective, that is really restrictive because I'm likely to get punched in the face. But we did have an interesting comment. Melantha?
Sure. Dr. Alyssa Wilson responded with, this highlights the ethical issues when using extinction-based procedures. There is also a really cool data by Sarah Bloom and Vollmer on using concurrent reinforcement schedules rather than extinction.
Yep. Really cool. Okay, so everyone that was going to have to do the manual holds for this gentleman, this is a real situation, were worried about having to do it, understanding that they had to do it for safety, but not really thrilled about it. And the agency was trying to get big guys, as big as this guy, to work with him. So I'm guessing that they thought it was kind of restrictive. They knew it was necessary for safety. They were hoping that doing it would decrease his hitting. So obviously they're also doing it as an intervention, but they were thinking that it was fairly restrictive for the implementers. And if you're going to make them do this, you got to think about how are you going to reinforce their behavior of following the procedure, and how are you going to reduce the restrictiveness of it. And I don't know if you can wear football helmets in the community and, not be standing out. But anyway, and sometimes I'm just being facetious, and I apologize for that. It's my warped sense of humor. So I guess I apologize if you're offended, but not that I'm doing it. Okay, so here are some things that you want to, Lucas is making me laugh while I'm talking. Here are some things that we think you want to think about. What safeguards can be put in place so that any strategy is used as designed and discontinued when appropriate. So you can put in place training, you can put in place frequent review, you can put in place a contract explaining the expectations, you can put in place extra oversight in the setting, and you can design an oversight system for the system, like the larger state DD services that are extra safeguards that can be put in place so that things are used. But we need to think about that and what can we do in those situations. Next slide. As a behavior analyst, you need to think about what are the legal and ethical practice guidelines for behavior analysts. So you need to think about and you need to know about what are the federal laws and rules within which within the context within which you're operating. So if you're just doing private pay and insurance, then you're still worried about the licensure laws and the BACB conduct rules, and you need to think about what kind of rules are in place federally and within the state that apply for you. And within your funding sources, what kinds of rules are in place. So Medicaid and CMS have some very specific rules that we need to be aware of. Schools have different kinds of guidelines and rules. And insurance agencies, insurance policies may also, because ultimately you and they will be liable if there's a lawsuit in a particular situation. So they may have some guidelines that you want to be aware of. Of course, there are the ABAI ethical practice guidelines and the APBS guidelines, and there's best practice in the literature. Just a caution about the literature, though. Oftentimes the literature is being applied or is a description of application in highly controlled settings done by highly trained people for a very short term usually in order to get published. We don't have a lot of long-term studies. We don't have a lot of studies done by typical direct care staff in typical applied settings where we go back and follow up after a long time. And so I'm not sure that you can say it's equivalent to working in the applied world. Just something to think about. Okay, so the next slide is, does the intervention plan or strategies align with the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis? And I think if we just use those as our standards, we would improve behavioral services quite a bit and also probably be practicing fairly ethically. So I think those encompass quite a lot in the restrictiveness category. What's the fallout if the strategies being considered are not used or if nothing is done? So that's the other side of the coin. Again, I'm not saying if it's restrictive you can't do it, and part of your argument to that effect is if I don't do something, things are going to be bad. Okay, then that makes it a little bit more justifiable that you go to the extreme, to a higher extreme of restrictiveness. And how would you determine this? And where do you document this consideration? And whose responsibility is this consideration process are things that we need to consider. Okay, and a cost-benefit analysis. Wendy brings up a cost-benefit analysis, and is it socially valid? Absolutely. All right, so next, how much responsibility does this person's environment have for the current problems? In other words, maybe they're coming from, and we've had this before, they're in a situation where they're receiving ISL services, and so we have some responsibility for them, Division of DD, waiver providers. If you're the consultant, we have some responsibility for their behavior. And when they go home, their brothers give them marijuana. So when they come back, and their mom doesn't provide them with their psychotropic medication and doesn't follow through with the plan. When they come back, we have the after effects of they haven't been on their psychotropic medications, the plan hasn't been followed, and they're used to getting high. That's the responsibility I'm talking about. How much are you going to implement contingencies with respect to this person when their environment has a great deal of responsibility for the current problems? So what are you doing to ameliorate those problems in the environment? What effect does this intervention have on the field of behavior analysis? And I don't think that's the first consideration, but I do think it's a consideration that we should have, and we have to have, because ultimately will not help anybody if behavior analysis isn't allowed to continue and grow. And would we use these strategies ourselves, and what does the literature tell us? So these are the questions that we try to ask ourselves when we're doing evaluations. And obviously, I'm taking up the whole 2 hours. Thank you very much. So something to think about, if you're not familiar with the public health model, there is a public health model, and this is what's used to just by the CDC and what we're using when we in the state do tiered supports, and really what positive behavior supports brought to the field that applied behavior analysis didn't necessarily consider. And that is that there are levels of prevention, if you will, or levels of intervention. And the first level is what you want everybody to experience and what you want everybody to do, and it's called primary prevention. So what are the universal precautions, if you will, if you want to take a medical view, or what are the universal truths that need to be true for everybody in order to have a good quality of life? And you want to make sure that those are in place. So those universal primary prevention strategies, which if you're the caregiver in a situation, that would be high rates of positive interactions, very engaging environments, not very coercive environments, so you're practicing catch 'em being good. And in a world where you're looking at things scientifically, you're taking data. That would be what the caregiver would do in a primary prevention environment, which would result in the individual receiving person-centered planning and having a safe environment that's coercive-free with enriched high rates of reinforcement and positive events, and a meaningful life with meaningful relationships and meaningful activities. Sounds like where I want to be. Secondary prevention would be, even though they have those primary prevention things in place, they still need a little bit more. And so maybe you're using, as a caretaker, you're using de-escalation and crisis management. You're practicing staying calm and cool. Maybe you're implementing some basic behavior plan, and you're problem solving around your data. So you're doing a little bit more, but you're also still doing primary prevention. And so I'm, as the person who's receiving these services, I'm getting crisis management and de-escalation. I've got a functional behavioral assessment. I have a behavior plan that's been developed with my family and me, and I'm learning skills to be more independent and successful in life, which actually sounds pretty good too. And tertiary prevention would be, even though you have primary prevention in place and you've tried secondary prevention, you still have a problem. And so this is like you have to have surgery and then you have to go to rehab afterwards. And so this is something like you have something in place to mitigate the effects of a plan. You have critical debriefing and crisis analysis. You have future plans. You have data review and analysis. And you change the environment and collect data, and you're doing continuous change. And you're experiencing debriefing, and you're experiencing your FBA being revised and your BSP being revised, and you're learning how to prevent future crises. So around that problem solving, you're learning more stuff. So I think it's a model that we should be considering when we're implementing plans. Are we evaluating that the primary prevention is in place? Is this a situation where secondary prevention could be the level of intervention that's necessary, or is this a situation where we need really individualized, highly specialized surgery to address the behavior? So just putting that out there. We don't learn that necessarily in graduate school, but I think it's a useful model for us to think about. Okay, Heike, next slide. So do you think the typical FBA process and resulting interventions take into account all three levels of those of prevention that I just described? All right, so this is really interesting. We're almost fairly evenly split here in yes and no, and so actually, I'm pleasantly surprised, and I'll just tell you that I'm a little bit jaded, and I'm glad that is true. That lots of people are taking into account those 3 levels of prevention, and you see that happening in FBA process. That's great. We've got 2 more slides that I have to get through, and everybody is teasing me because I didn't think I'd make a whole hour today. But the next slide is just a reminder of what the context is in DD. Our services are funded through federal monies and local tax dollars if you're getting anything from county boards. And those funding sources have rules regarding the service, what it is, documentation, billing, and what strategies you can use. In Missouri, our services are community and residential services, and we don't really have treatment settings. We don't have a lot of Johns Hopkins environments here with professionals on site. So that's something for us to consider. I think that makes some strategies more restrictive because you don't have on-site oversight all the time. And the Home and Community-Based Services Rule has tighter stipulation and reporting requirements for state Medicaid funding. And this is a recent change, and it should have always been so, but it wasn't, and it's something that we have to know is true now. So there's been a change. We need to be more careful about it, and we need to have much better reporting. So that's just the current context. And the last slide is, go back. Thank you. Given the current context in DD services, are strategies that include aversive consequences necessarily more restrictive, again, considering the current context? So A, no, the restrictive value is the restrictive value. B, no, aversive consequences that are not extreme are well accepted in the Missouri DD culture. And yes, the philosophy of the field of DD services and the current funding entities have heightened the restrictive value of aversive consequences. So ABC, the next question in here is, so you're going to give 3 answers. Does restrictive mean unethical? I don't know, I'm asking you. Does restrictive mean unethical? A, no. B, it depends. Or C, yes. And the third question is, does determining a strategy is restrictive mean that it's prohibited or cannot be used? So 3 questions, 3 answers, and then we'll be done, and I'll have you sign out once we discuss this. So please answer 3 questions. Okay, so these are really interesting results here, so I want to go over them quickly. So are the strategies that include aversive consequences necessarily more restrictive considering the current context? So we had a split here, a little bit of a split, not too much of a split, but 6 people said no, the value of the strategy depends on the severity of the behavior. But most people said yes, the philosophy of the field of DD services and the funding entities have heightened the restrictive value. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. Unfortunately, not God or Queen of the Universe. So this is an opinion. I would lean towards the argument of C, yes. Things are more heightened, and so the value is more restrictive for aversive consequences. But again, no right or wrong answer. So the second question, does restrictive mean unethical? And we had that same kind of split. We had 19 people say it depends on how a strategy is and the support for its use, how restrictive the strategy is and the support for its use. And 6 people said no. So that's interesting. I would say no on that one. So I disagree with the majority on that one. I don't think restrictive necessarily means unethical, depending on how it's implemented and how other things are considered. So that's interesting. Would be a great discussion over cocktails later. Does determining a strategy as restrictive mean that it's prohibited or cannot be used? And so most of you said no, and I would agree. I don't mean prohibited or don't do it when I say restrictive. That might be the conclusion that you reach, but that's not what I mean when I'm talking about restrictive, nor I don't think is it what any of us in this room today mean. So interesting. Thank you for your participation. The references are on the back of this. When you registered, the slides were available to you, and we will post them on our website along with the question and answers and the related articles that we discussed or Lucas discussed here. I will be sending to your email addresses your 2 ethics CEs if you met all the participation requirements. And I think at the end of this, there'll be a short evaluation of this webinar, and we appreciate your comments. So anybody have anything to say?
Well, we greatly appreciate the interaction and discussion this morning. We had some great comments and great interaction for a WebEx that sometimes is hard to achieve, but we greatly appreciate your responses.
And I just want to say stay tuned for additional webinars.
Same bat time, same bat station.